Welcome to the Revolutionaries of Wellbeing podcast. I'm founder and host, Sarah McGuinness. The Revolutionaries of Wellbeing, or ROW, is a community of wellbeing managers from organisations around the globe. At ROW, we develop you as a wellbeing leader, giving you a powerful support network, professional development, and workplace wellbeing solutions so that you can focus on giving your employees the right support at the right time. To be stronger, better, and faster at improving wellbeing in your workplace, professional development is key. These discussions on workplace wellbeing are designed to inspire, share ideas, and raise awareness of important issues we can all take action on. The interviews are recorded as part of our monthly Wellbeing Wednesday webinars. In this episode, we turn our focus to psychosocial risk factors. Addressing psychosocial risk factors is an important part of creating a robust wellbeing strategy. It can be the difference between a wellbeing program that takes a bandaid approach and a wellbeing strategy that gets to the heart of workplace wellbeing issues. So has the pandemic changed psychosocial risk factors? And what can organisations do to identify and mitigate these risks? Joining us to explore this important topic is Professor Bevan Catley from Massey University. Drawing on the extensive New Zealand Barometer research and other new research works, Bevan takes us on a journey to better understand the topic and the top issues. He also provides tips for wellbeing managers to better support employees now and in the future.
If you'll indulge me, I'll start at the beginning. So forgive me if I'm telling some of you how to suck eggs, but it might just help give a little bit of context. Okay, so as we know, right, work impacts health and well-being, and our health and well-being impacts our work. As part of a business school, we're particularly interested in the way work impacts our health. Like let's call it the work determinants of health, because we know that coming to work can be really uplifting and rewarding and really enjoyable, but it can also be a bit stink, right? There are negative. It can be stressful, it can be debilitating, and it can be damaging. Now, for us, the design, organisation, and management of work is a key influence on the health, safety, performance, and general satisfaction of an individual, and the way we experience that over our working lives. Now, the way work is organised, managed, and led, and the interactions this creates within, the context of our work, that's what we would term psychosocial factors, right? So psychosocial factors is the way work is organised, designed, managed, and led, and the interactions, right? So that's psychosocial factors. Now, these psychosocial factors are neutral, right? But they can be positive or they can be negative. So when work is well designed, organised, managed, and led, it can contribute to positive outcomes. And not just in the sense of the absence of bad stuff, but in the sense of contributing to individuals and organisations thriving, right? Through enhanced motivation, self-confidence, engagements, feelings of mastery, that kind of stuff. However, when work is not so well designed, organised, managed, and led, there's then potential for those factors to be negative. So stuff like work overload, role conflict, poor working relationships, and these create psychosocial hazards. And psychosocial hazards are events or situations that have the potential to cause individual and organisational harm, right? So we have psychosocial factors, managed poorly can lead to hazards. Now, psychosocial hazards are one of a typical category in a taxonomy of hazards. So in the New Zealand context, if you think of WorkSafe, WorkSafe have 5 categories of hazards. They have physical hazards, chemical hazards, biological hazards, ergonomic hazards, and psychosocial hazards. So those are the typical hazards. Psychosocial risk, then, is the likelihood or the probability that a person will be harmed or experience adverse health effects if exposed to a psychosocial hazard, right? So psychosocial factors, psychosocial hazards can then lead to harm. Now, while that sort of makes for a nice sort of linear pathway, it is, of course, not like that. Psychosocial harm is multi-causal, it's complex, these things interact with one another. What is also really quite crucial is that most researchers would agree that psychosocial factors play a role in most, if not all, harmful outcomes. So they're really quite crucial part of making sense of what's happening in your workplace. Hopefully that made some sort of sense.
Yeah, that's a really good way of describing it. And then there's another term that I've seen come up, and we will get into the barometer in a moment, but around this idea of a safety climate.
Yeah. Maybe I can talk about that when we talk about the barometer, because that is one of the areas that is seen to be really, really useful as a predictive factor. Organisations that have strong psychosocial safety climates then gives them some predictive benefit.
So I'm keen to jump into a few more of those things that you alluded to in terms of the definition. So if you've got some stats there that we can get our heads around what this looks like, on a day-to-day basis, perhaps in New Zealand or globally.
Yeah. They're not great. They're good stats, but they're not. They don't make for happy reading, I should say. So, sometimes you get asked, well, why should we care about the psychosocial stuff? Okay, there's plenty going on. So, I guess my argument to you, and I hope I'm preaching to the converted, is we'd probably say there are three key reasons why you should care about that psychosocial stuff. Okay, so the first one is around reducing the social and economic costs of harm. So if you want some stats, here I think are some pretty sobering ones from the New Zealand context. So this is out of WorkSafe. So in 2020, there were 66 work-related fatalities. That's down from 110 in 2019. And why 2019 was an exceptionally bad year was because of Whakaari White Island. Already in 2021, WorkSafe have recorded 38 work-related fatalities. On top of that, if that's not bad enough, there are about 750 to 900 deaths each year from work-related ill health. So that's a lot of grief and a lot of sadness and a lot of lives lost and families are devastated from those sorts of numbers. About 5,000 to 6,000 hospitalisations each year as a result of work-related ill health. WorkSafe calculates that each year about 45,000 life years are lost as a result of work-related injuries and ill health. And that's running the full spectrum. That includes cancers, MSDs, injuries, cardiovascular disease, hearing loss, the whole horrible basket. Of those 45,000 life years lost, about 8,500 are lost annually to work-related mental ill health. So that's depression, anxiety, and so forth. So that's reason number one, which I think is a pretty good reason. Reason number two is, of course, around our legal responsibilities, right? So psychosocial harm is arguably implied rather than explicit in New Zealand legislation in the Health and Safety at Work Act. So we know PCBUs have a primary duty of care. We know PCBU officers have to exercise due diligence, and workers need to take reasonable care. And within that framework, both in terms of the purpose of the Act and within various sections of the Act, there is now an emphasis on wellbeing, health, and the maintenance of the work environment. And within the legislation now, a person's behaviour has been explicitly mentioned there as a hazard. Also, work-related health is one of WorkSafe. So WorkSafe is, for those of you not familiar with the New Zealand context, is New Zealand's national regulator. It's one of their 7 key priority areas. So that's the second reason. So harm, fulfill our responsibilities, and then there is to reduce the individual and organisational harm. So at the individual level, it's about addressing stress, violence, bullying, the injuries, the anxiety, depression, cardiovascular disease, so that those individual harm, and then the harm at the organisational level to the organisation. So with those individual harms comes lost time, productivity, absenteeism, turnover, low engagement, legal costs, and reputational damage. So I think that's, in my opinion, three pretty compelling reasons why psychosocial risk, because we use that term to encompass the entire domain often, is something that we should be very much thinking about along with our traditional health and safety concerns.
I like the term catch-all, because what I'm picking up as well is this, and I alluded to it at the start, is that actually looking at those things is the difference when we look at workplace wellbeing between, and I'm going to be facetious here and say the fruit bowl, you're looking at the fruit bowl and actually looking at some of those things that make a really big difference when we put the emphasis on them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, a lot of this is about getting back to thinking about, the way work, as I say, the way work is organised and managed and led, and how crucial that is to our well-being, and how well-being is also crucial to performance. So you can have your cake and eat it too. Okay, so investment in well-being and investment in all this kind of stuff, will have a positive impact on individual and organizational performance. In some ways that makes sense. If you have individuals who are feeling stressed and feeling anxious and feeling depressed, or being bullied, they are not bringing their A game to work. They are not, being their best self at work. You cannot then expect them to be engaged and being motivated when basically they might be experiencing all these other, pretty crappy things.
I think we see that come up often. We hear these stories from organisations where an organisation might do something like give employees a $100 voucher to spend on their wellbeing, and yet they're in an environment perhaps it's not supportive of any of those things. Are those things you've come across?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a gesture like that, will have value in and of itself, and will, might be quite reasonably seen as a really, a positive thing and a really important symbolic gesture from the organisation. But that needs to happen within a suite of other things, right? Ultimately, what you want to be investing your time and effort is in that primary prevention space, right? So if those things don't actually end up changing the conditions, then you ain't going to see any of that improvement. So, it's about remembering that primary prevention is where it's at.
And so I'm interested, we've also alluded to at this point, there's a new ISO out, or there's a new framework out, but of course there are lots of frameworks. So how does an organisation start to make sense of a framework to use to even evaluate any of this? Yeah,
absolutely. So let's say that ISO. So they just released, I think it was in the year, ISO 45003, which is perhaps not the most exciting title you'll ever come across. But anyway, so this ISO, as I say, was released early in the year, and it gives designed to give practical guidance on managing psychosocial health and safety. It has some really great guidance on preconditions for implementing initiatives, identifying hazards, and the management and monitoring of those hazards. So it's definitely worth hunting out and having a look at. Because I think it does a really good job of being pretty user-friendly and pretty practical-orientated. Now, if you don't like that one, there are, as you say, there are plenty of others. So here's a couple of my favourites. In terms of broader frameworks, there's the ILO's Decent Work Framework, which is something I'm not sure gets too much press in the New Zealand context. I'll admit, wasn't particularly au fait with it myself until I got asked to teach a course on it. So I know a bit more than I did before. So the ILO Decent Work Framework is much broader, has a broader focus, and it's built around what they term these 4 pillars: rights at work, employment creation, social protection, and social dialogue. And then there are 10 determinants that fall out of those 4 pillars, one of those being a safe and work environment. And that ILO Decent Framework underpins, is integral to the UN Agenda for Sustainable Development, which we probably are a little bit more familiar with. There's also the WHO's Healthy Workplaces, which I think has a bit more prominence in the New Zealand context. And that brings together 4 domains of action, and then they have a little around continuous improvement with at the centre being leadership engagement and work involvement. So those are couple of global ones. But closer to home, Te Whare Tapa Whā is a very influential model for understanding Māori health and wellbeing, developed by Sir Mason Drury, and that I think that has a lot of really important and useful insights. And of course, there's all the stuff available on WorkSafe. So how do you figure out? How do you maybe navigate all that, like you asked? Well, I suggest it's coming back to having a really clear purpose about what you're trying to achieve and why. And then that will help to guide you to what I would suggest is basically cherry picking things, right? So cherry picking from the frameworks and the measures that are evidence-based and, have some validity, if you will. Because what I think you're looking for your own organisation is developing an approach that, is contextualised, it's tailored for your work, and it's underpinned by ownership and social dialogue. So if you want, a nice little alliteration, contextualised, customised, and consultation would be my 3 little C words.
I like those. Would you mind repeating those again, because they were so good?
What did I say? Contextualised, customised, and consultation.
Oh, now I'm going to pick up on that last one, consultation, because isn't that an interesting one in the organisations? Sometimes we do that well, and sometimes not so well. Yeah, it's one of the things that I've found quite interesting. In terms of developing my own knowledge, is how social dialogue is internationally seen as fundamental to a lot of this, improving the health and wellbeing. And while that's replicated in New Zealand in the Health and Safety at Work Act in terms of that consultation and participation, I think you're right. We probably do underplay it a bit, but it's absolutely, I think, vital if you're trying to get people to buy into these things and to make the initiatives that you want to put in place sustainable, basically. So not only effective, but also sustainable. If you want them to become embedded in organisational practice, to become part of your sort of BAU culture, I suppose, then people have got to buy into it. So there's got to be a sense of ownership from management, and that consultation and participation from the workforce. And also your workers will have a very, very good sense of what works and what doesn't in terms of that work environment, right? That is so true. I mean, how often do we hear things, cascading down from management, and yet it might look different, in other parts of the business. I do want to move to the barometer now. So perhaps probably easiest to start with a bit of a description about the barometer and its purpose behind it.
Sure, yeah. So, it's a project that we started 3 or 4 years ago, and we're very fortunate enough to have some funding from WorkSafe. So our thanks to WorkSafe for getting this off the ground. And the idea behind the barometer was we were very conscious that there's a gap in terms of knowledge and data around both the prevalence and the nature and the impact of psychosocial hazards and harm in the New Zealand workplace. And we saw that the barometer has been able to contribute to filling that gap. So that's, I guess, the first reason for doing it. And then the second was about being able to, give some practical help to organisations, right? So the idea then is those organisations that participate in the barometer, they get a report, they get some information back on terms of their own, where they sit in terms of psychosocial risks for their organisation, that can be both monitored and benchmarked against other organisations participating in the barometer. So that was the kind of the rationale for it. What did we find? Do you want me to say a couple of words
jump into it and say, because it's happened over 3 years and you're currently doing the 4th one at the moment.
Yeah, just closed. So if there's anyone out there who organisations participated in the barometer, thanks heaps. Really appreciate you being involved. I think we had a bit of a record turnout this year, so we're really pleased and busy working away on starting to prepare the reports and get those organisational reports out back to organisations before Christmas. So look out for that as an early Christmas gift from the Healthy Work Group. What did we find? So in terms of sort of big picture kind of stuff, unfortunately, New Zealand organisations and workers continue to be quite vulnerable to a range of psychosocial risks. So whether this be ill treatment, bullying, cyberbullying, sexual harassment, in particular bullying, and also in terms of negative impacts to mental wellbeing. So about 50% of respondents in the barometer from the 2020 data, which was about 1,400 individuals, reported an absence for physical or mental health in the last 12 months. That's half that sample reported an absence for physical or mental health in the last 12 months. But, and the other thing I think that is important to take on board, and probably this will not come as a surprise to a number of you, but there are different risk profiles. And so in other words, not all categories of workers have the same risk profile for ill treatment and the impacts on mental wellbeing. So for example, female and younger workers were more likely to report psychological distress out of the barometer. Mental wellbeing was much higher for males and older workers. Female and casual workers reported higher levels of job insecurity. Females and supervisors were more likely to come to work when feeling unwell. Older workers were way more engaged in their work than younger workers. So those are sort of some of the high level things. But in terms of what does that barometer report in terms of how you might go about improving your workplace or your work environment, where we're starting to land on is what we're sort of tentatively calling these 4 pillars, right? So where organisations demonstrate more strength in terms of organisational justice, inclusion, psychosocial safety climate, and management competencies, the better they turn to be performing, if you like, in terms of wellbeing. So in other words, if your workforce perceives that they are being treated fairly across all areas of the organisation and the employment relationship, they tend to report much stronger in terms of ill treatment and wellbeing. If they feel included in the decisions affecting work and have access to information and have the resources to do the job, okay, they also feel positive. The other is what we've mentioned before, was that psychosocial safety climate. And what that is essentially is the workforce's perception that managers sincerely care about their well-being, right? So in other words, management are visible, they have a substantive and ongoing commitment to psychological health and safety, and they prioritise it. So basically, if your workforce perceives that management, senior managers in particular, take this stuff seriously and do something about it, and also include the workers in decisions and initiatives around psychological health and safety, the better the organisation is. And the fourth one is management competence. So where your workers perceive that, in particular, line managers and managers generally possess qualities or competencies such as having integrity, empowering their staff, are good at conflict management, are empathetic, are accessible and available, that also is positive. So justice, inclusion, psychosocial safety climate, or PSC, management competencies. These are the 4 things that we are now starting to push. So if you are looking to invest some time and energy in improving your work environment, those might be 4 places where you could think about doing some work.
And it sounds to me like those four do rest heavily on leaders, team leaders, management. That sounds like there's a lot of influence from perhaps people in our audience around trying to bring those leaders on that journey. There'll be some who get it and some who don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So particularly, the sincere and workers, I think, have an exceptional ability to know when it's just a box ticking, going through the motions kind of thing. Like, nothing will destroy your initiatives quicker than the perception that it's basically insincere, right? So having senior staff or influential staff that take this seriously, committed, consistent in that space is really important. And that's not just like the CEO, the senior manager, but your first line supervisor. If you think about it, again, I'm sure I'm telling people things they already know. Your first line supervisor in many ways is your organizational first responder, right? If they're the person that many staff are going to go to when they have, the drama, right? And so if they don't have a good relationship with that supervisor, their immediate manager, it's either they don't feel they can trust them, or they don't feel they can go and talk to them, or they don't feel that the manager's going to do anything about it. Kind of not a lot is going to help. There's not going to be any of those improvements that you're wanting to see.
That first line responder, team leaders as first line responder is actually kind of, I'm sure, a bit of a light bulb for many people, because we think of first responders as those people we're training up in mental health, first aid or physical first aid. But actually, as you say, when we're thinking first responders, actually it's management.
Yeah, and obviously this will depend a little bit on the size of the organisation and how work is organised. But having managed a staff of 30 in a large organisation, there's lots of room to not know what's going on, and lots of you don't necessarily have the relationships. The most close working relationships you're going to have will be with your immediate work group and probably your supervisor. So then if your supervisor is really good at being able to read the health and well-being room, as it were, and can provide good guidance, can solve problems, can be really proactive, basically be a good manager, then they're going to be able to resolve a lot of stuff at source before we need to start thinking about, EAP, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And let's jump COVID over this, because the barometer's now been pre-COVID and during COVID. Have you seen changes?
Yeah, no. So that was one of the things that actually really was quite surprising, is that in terms and methodologically, while we might have the same organisations, we don't necessarily have the same individuals. So making comparisons between years is a little bit fraught. But in general terms, we would have thought we might have seen a little bit more of impact from COVID, but we didn't. And so we were kind of like, that's a bit of a head scratcher. Why didn't we? Partly it might be because of the way the survey is run, in the sense that we got next to no organisations from, like hospitality. So the organisations in the sectors that were most likely to have been impacted by COVID were not in the sample, and also to individuals who might have been most impacted by COVID, needed to be at work to be able to complete the survey. So we might not have captured the right people and the right organisations that have been most impacted. We would also like to think that these organisations that have participated in the barometer are proactive in the space and doing things, and have also been participating in the barometer, maybe for their second, if not even their third time. So we would like to think that they had taken on board the information that they're getting, and that they're making changes, and basically they're starting to build up some resource and and some credit, which has allowed them to be able to buffer some of those impacts from COVID. So I'm hoping that it's as much because those organisations are doing a good job, and I'm sure they are, because having talked with people, there are lots of good people doing good things in a lot of the organisations. There's some good work going on.
And what are you looking ahead to 2022, and whether it's across the academic literature or what you're seeing already from the barometer, what do you think's ahead?
Yeah, that's well, as an academic, the exciting part. I think you already mentioned it, that, you know, I think we'll see and hear a lot more about psychosocial risk and the psychosocial domain. Probably wasn't that long ago, you know, maybe 2-3 years ago, if you were talking to people and you said, oh, psychosocial risk, and most people wouldn't be familiar with what is he talking about. So I think it's much more part of the health and safety discourse than perhaps it was. So, and I think that will continue, given particularly the emphasis that WorkSafe is put on it. So that's the first thing. I think next year there'll be, you know, continual development and refinement of this, managing this at work, at home dynamic. So tweaking those health and wellbeing things. I think we'll also see some new and emerging issues, and perhaps some old issues given a bit of a new lease of life, as it were, as they kind of manifest in these new sort of working arrangements. So I guess what I'm sort of thinking here is, next year we might see a lot more around things like stress and overwork, fatigue, work-family conflict, social and professional isolation. I think might be something that we'll have to deal with. Perceived fairness of various arrangements, and probably people in the audience have already had this, you know, had conversations about, well, you know, some people can work from home, some people can't. We've had this in our own place. Academics, it's much easier for them to work from home, but professional staff, not so easy. We might see more potentially, because we're at home and online. Maybe cyberbullying might be something that we see a bit of an uptick in potentially. Working from home with perhaps suboptimal workstations and work environment might breathe new life into musculoskeletal disorders, the MSDs, repetitive strain injuries, and the good old slips, trips and falls, right? As we, you know, working on our ergonomic kitchen bench with power boards and extension leads all over the place. So that might be the 2022 view. If we were to look a bit further ahead, what I'm sort of interested in exploring, because that's the privilege I get as being an academic, is the future of work discourse, and how those anticipated changes around the future of work conversation, how they'll impact on health and safety, especially if the trends that are associated with the future of work, that they might exacerbate those sort of current risk factors and trends. So what I have in mind here is, you know, the things that are associated with the future of work, like, you know, more flexible working arrangements, the casualisation of the labour force, the rise in non-standard work, you know, the threats to social dialogue, which we've talked a little bit about, maybe decreases in worker representation, a rise of the informal economy, AI, working longer hours, changes in demographics, all of these kinds of stuff that's going on in the world of work, and how that, as I say, how that will impact. So, you know, for example, might we see higher injury rates and more severe injuries as our workforce gets older? Or might we see less work-related injuries as female employment continues to rise? Because we know that, in general, female workers have lower injury rates and less severe injuries. Might we see more stress and conflict and violence as a result of more insecure employment and precarious work? Might we see more threats to physical and mental well-being as people work longer hours and working multiple jobs, and have potentially less protections, less social protections? You know, what might be the impact of having less worker engagement and participation in health and safety? So if we're already talking about it being a bit of a struggle now, what might it be like if the trends around casualisation and precarious work and gig work and all those other sort of flash buzzwords, become a bit more prominent? So yeah, there's lots. Yeah, I'm not going to become unemployed anytime soon.
No, I don't think so. I think it's really interesting from the mental health perspective, because I know a few of us have been grappling with, we talk a lot about mental health awareness in organisations, and there's a lot of kind of awareness-based stuff, but actually what you're talking to and alluding to there is some really big, meaty issues that are on the horizon that will have a really big mental health impact. And it's not awareness. There's a lot of work that needs to happen behind the scenes.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I guess for some of those things, it's easy to think of them as being quite abstract and as happening either elsewhere or out there. But again, take changing demographics. I mean, COVID has really, highlighted, issues around demography and patterns of immigration, right, and all that kind of stuff. And there is now a reasonable conversation around older workers and managing older workers and the contribution of older workers. And part of our other thing we do is some work in that space, and is trying to break down some of those myths and misconceptions about older workers. And one of the things we found in the barometer and other stuff we've done, like, if you want someone who's really, really going to be engaged, well, older workers tend to be more engaged. So, yeah, there's all those sorts of things. So in other words, they will have a concrete impact on your organisation. People will need to be thinking about how you manage some of those broader changes that will come and filter down to everyday organisational life.
Which is a good segue then into going, okay, so if organisations are sitting here thinking, I really need to be across the psychosocial risk factors. Yep. If they haven't done the barometer, where do they start? What are they looking for?
Yeah. Okay, how long have we got? Right. Okay, so in some ways, and forgive me if this all sounds a bit slightly glib and flippant, because it's way more complicated, as I'm sure many people know. Okay, so in some ways, doing the measuring is the easy part, right? It's about how making sure that your measures are meaningful and useful and stuff, and that's about having very much a systematic approach. So, and that includes doing a lot of pre-work, and that's where I think that ISO standard can be quite useful. So some useful things before you get round to thinking about the measuring would be things like, well, okay, making sure you understand the organisation, your organisation and its context, including the expectations of your workforce. Have you got the leadership commitment? Have you got the worker participation stuff, so on? So in particular, when we're talking about bullying and talking probably with more an HR focused audience, one of the things I like to say to the HR is about, not only do you have to be the expert in your organisation in terms of knowing, stuff, all that kind of stuff, but also to be the expert on your organisation. And that's understanding the way your organisation works, the context, the culture, the environment, all of that kind of stuff. So it's about having that domain knowledge, but also in terms of those technical competencies, but also understanding the way your organisation ticks. So being the expert in your organisation and the expert on your organisation. I think I mentioned this before about having a really clear plan about what are you trying to achieve and why. So one of the things when we talk to about the barometer participants is, okay, well, what are you trying to do? This is not about just trying to increase your score. What are you trying to do and why? And then, so that's about having a plan and then tying the indicators and the measures to that plan. Chances are you already probably collect a good deal of data. So review your data and your knowledge for the evidence of harm. So this is about going through and doing a bit of a stock take and asking yourself, so how does harm manifest in my organisation? Okay. And now you'll have, chances are you'll either have some pre-existing measures, or you'll have some proxies for harm. So things like, absenteeism rates, sudden resignations, drops in motivation and performance, that kind of stuff. And then, so having sort of a sense of where the harm is, then start to think about where the likely sources of that harm. And that's where, going through the job description, doing the consultation, the talking, the incident reports, going through those, your general observations. And a useful way to be thinking about, trying to identify those hazards would be thinking about the ones that are associated with the content of work and those that are associated with the context of work. And there's a nice little taxonomy that sort of synthesizes down a lot of research into basically, there are 10 sort of key hazards. And that might be a really useful way to start going, okay, to what extent do these play out in my organisation? And then it's then about thinking about, well, how likely are these hazards in terms of the risk to harm, and then prioritising. Then you can start to think about then the measures. So what would be the indicators of a failure? Okay? And then comparing that with the measures that you already have in place, and then adapt. So there's a lot of pre-work before we start doing the measure. There are lots of measures out there. It's a bit first of about having a clear sense of what it is that you want to do, right? There are lots of things that will go out and measure stress or whatever it is that you want to, but don't just rely on the stats that you collect. That qualitative side, the getting out and the asking workers, asking supervisors, attending staff meetings, doing the pulse check, the temperature check, whatever sort of way you want to think about it, of the work environment is also really useful, as well as just the numbers that come out of your reports.
So I have one last question for you, but I'm going to give the heads up now to those in the audience. If you'd like to ask any questions of Bevan, now's a great time to put them into the chat. But my last question then really is, and I think that's really useful because it gives a really good framework for people to follow. If they stepped off the call now, what would be kind of like the top 3 things you would suggest that they did?
Okay. I guess this is talking about this. It might seem, oh goodness me, I have to go and do a whole lot of stuff. So first of all, I'd be saying is you don't have to reinvent the wheel or develop a whole lot of new systems. Much of the improvements and the protections come from ensuring that you have a good management practices in a healthy work environment. So a lot of what I'm talking about actually comes back to Management 101 kind of stuff. So doing those fundamentals well. So don't reinvent the wheel. Second thing would be invest in management competencies. We're becoming quite a big fan of that. So, and that's right through that process. This is where the HR side of things becomes important. So, in terms of identifying those potential supervisors, yeah, by all means, focus on those technical competencies, but you also want the interpersonal competence, the soft skills, if you were. So, making sure that they feature prominently in your assessment of potential supervisors, and then continue to develop those competencies in your supervisors. Assess and reward them for demonstrating those competencies. Right? If you want people to be to display those kinds of behaviours, then Psych 101, reward them. And then commit, consult, and follow through, right? And that's what the thing I was saying before about how box ticking and sincerity will destroy your efforts. So those would be my sort of 3 big ones. And then there's some more specific things, in terms of, around the work environment.
I think that it's interesting if you think about that term psychosocial, and I'm just going to put the emphasis on the social side of it, isn't it? It is a lot of those networks and relationships we have with other people, regardless of level in the organisation.
Oh, absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, when you think about it, when you ask people, well, what do you love about your job and why do you keep coming? Most people will, somewhere in the answer, will talk about the people that they work with. And if you ask people, why do you leave? A lot of people will tend to talk about, particularly their relationship with their manager. Having a poor working relationship with your supervisor is often a key reason why people leave.
Thanks again for listening today. It's been great to have you along. If you're keen to join the Revolutionaries of Wellbeing, head to Row Wellbeing, that's ROWwellbeing.com, and follow the links to sign up. If you're in our community, thanks again, and we look forward to catching up with you really soon.